Hello, everyone. It's good evening from Sydney, Australia. Thank you for joining our session, Meet the Editors 2020, Exploring Conflict of Interest in Academic Publishing of Health Systems Research. This series of sessions have become a feature now in the Health Systems Global Conferences, and this is, I think, the third in the series. In previous years, we've covered different topics ranging from quality research to other issues that have to do with global health journals. And this year we are focusing on conflict of interest in particular because it picks up on previous conversations within the health systems community and the global health community around how academic journals and research funders and academic institutions govern the process of research and conflict of interest research. I will be moderating this session along with Virginia Weissman. So I am Shaya Bimbola, Editor-in-Chief of BMJ Global Health, and Virginia Weissman is the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Health Policy and Planning. And the anchor for the session, I wonder if that's the correct title, will be Professor Kara Hansen. But before we hear from Kara, I will hand you over to Virginia, who will give a few tips on how to use the platform.
Thanks, Shay. Hi, everybody. Yes, it's Virginia here. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you again at the HSG conference. I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you. In terms of the rules of engagement for this session, we would like everybody to be part of this session by posting comments in the Q&A box. You'll see that on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm sure you're all becoming quite the professional at using this system now. If you run into any problems, there's a live support. You'll see a little icon of a person above the Q&A. Just click on there and someone will come to your rescue. When you're posting questions, if you can direct those at a particular panel member, then by all means do that. But also open questions to everyone is fine. Full screen is always the best way to view the session. The sessions are recorded, so I hope you don't have any concerns with that. It's obviously a way in which others can be part of the session at another time, because we're all joining from different time zones and it doesn't suit everybody. I think that's enough in terms of housekeeping. Thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it. Over to Kara Hansen.
Well, hello, everybody from Oxford, where I'm sitting today. We really are a truly global group, aren't we? Well, welcome. This is a really, as Saya said, this has become a feature of the HSR conferences. And at each conference, the editors of some of the most important and prominent journals in our field of health policy and systems research have come together to debate some current issues. So this year, we have indeed agreed to take on the issues of conflict of interest. And to help us consider those issues, we've assembled a really fantastic panel of editors. So Virginia and Shaya themselves are editors of Health Policy and Planning and BMJ Global Health, respectively. We also have Margaret Saunders, who's the Deputy Editor for Global Health at Health Affairs. Next slide. We have Jocelyn Clark, Executive Editor at The Lancet. Next slide, please. We have Zoe Mullen, who's the Editor-in-Chief of Lancet Global Health. Next. Stephen Hodgins, who is the Editor-in-Chief for Global Health, Science and Practice. Next slide. Michael Reich, who is the Founding Editor-in-Chief of Health Systems and Reform. Next slide, please. And Tilly Cryer, who's the editor for BMC Health Services Research. So the way we're going to run this is that we have some questions that I'm going to pose to our panel members, and they will They'll also, hopefully they will riff off each other and be able to have some exchange amongst them as well. And from time to time, I'm going to pose them questions that are coming in on the live Q&A. So can I ask you, if you have questions or comments that you'd like the panelists to respond to please post those in the live Q&A, and I will bring as many of those as possible. So I'll kind of ask them a couple of questions, which they'll pass around, and then I'll go to the Q&A questions and pose those directly. Where appropriate, they will also respond directly in writing on the platform as well. So you may see some questions being answered there. So I hope that's a good place for us to start. I think I will start with my first question, which is, who can have a conflict of interest, and how do you go about identifying a conflict of interest? So if an author or editor or reviewer thinks they have a conflict of interest, what should they do about it? What I'm going to do is ask those questions to each of the editors. I'm going to move around my screen in the order in which I can see you, and then some of the other questions I'll pose more directly. But that's kind of the opener. And Jocelyn, I wonder if I could ask you to start.
Oh, first up, thank you, Cara, and thanks for including me. I'm really looking forward to the session. So an answer to your question, every one of us has competing interests, and the best remedy is disclosure. And that's important, of course, because it's critical to know that we're not the best judges of our own biases. That's for others to do, and disclosure helps facilitate that.
Great, thanks very much, Jocelyn. Margaret, over to you.
Hello, yes, thank you. It's definitely something that we feel authors, reviewers, and staff need to address, and we have procedures in place for each of those. The authors are expected to answer a series of detailed questions about possible conflict of interest. Reviewers are expected to respond to similar questions, and our editorial staff are also expected to acknowledge if they have a conflict of interest in any way with authors submitting papers.
Thanks, Margaret. Shaya, over to you.
Yeah, so it's been said already, all of us could have conflict of interest, and the best thing to do is to declare them. But it's also important, I think, to note that in particular, editors and reviewers could have conflict of interest. And there are far fewer ways of thinking about those than it is to think about how authors might have conflict of interest. And I think it's one of the areas of development and growth that we could have in our field, to think more carefully about how journals could be more transparent about what the conflict of interest of editors and reviewers are, and put in place processes to deal with that, the same way we've done for others.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Shaya. Virginia.
I think one of the issues coming from the perspective of the author, I completely agree that this is an issue for editors, for guest editors, for reviewers, for authors. But from the point of view of the author, and perhaps, perhaps anyone, it's really asking yourself, would a reasonable reader feel misled or perhaps even deceived in any way? I think it's sort of that kind of reflection. That's the kind of question that you might ask yourself if you're wondering if you have a conflict of interest with someone looking at this work, feel like they may have been misled in any way at all. That's probably a guiding question.
One thing I would note here that we haven't actually defined what we mean by that conflict yet. And so I think it's quite common to declare financial conflicts. So you might feel misled if you had received a grant from or owned shares in a company that was implicated in the research that you were doing. That's a fairly obvious one, but I presume that we're talking about a broader range of influences potentially that could, as Virg says, could reasonably be judged to have influenced your writing or your interpretation or analysis. So do you want to say something about other forms of conflict than financial conflict?
Was that me?
I'm sorry, Zoe, that was
Yeah.
me.
Sorry, didn't quite catch the beginning. Yeah, I think that the one thing that journals have you know, it's their role to take the lead on is to have a definition of what's meant by a conflict of interest. So when an author's or anyone is being asked to declare this conflict, they should for sure have a definition. And I think that's something that we're perhaps a little bit lacking on, because if you, for example, go and look at the ICMJE conflict of interest forms, they are very financially oriented. And so when it's clear that you can sort of prompt authors to declare very specific financial issues, but it's much more difficult when it's non-financial. And so I think we're a little bit behind the curve on this at the moment. So there's some more thought needs to be put into what defines a non-financial conflict and how we can help authors to declare them, or not just authors, obviously, reviewers also, and indeed editors.
Yeah. So that's something we should kind of unpack a little bit more, the different ways that non-financial influences can potentially create conflicts. Michael, over to you.
So thank you, Cara. So I come at this from a question of sort of principles. And I start with the principle that everyone is a bundle of interests. So we all are constituted as human beings by a bundle of interests. And the second principle is that the goal of conflict of interest is it's not an end in itself, but it's really a means to an end. So we don't want people filling in boxes for the sake of filling in boxes. There has to be some larger objective of doing this. And so then the question is, well, what's the end goal? And at least for me, the end goal is twofold. One is to improve the quality of published papers. And the second is to let readers know the relevant interests so that they can interpret papers and identify any potential sources of bias. So this is the third principle, is a transparency principle. I think that the critical question is what constitutes conflict, or even what constitutes competing. And so it's not clear who decides that. So this is really a question of governance. I think it's a governance both within journals and in a broader space of deciding, and which conflicts matter. And I think those are complicated questions to think about, and maybe in some sense the heart of the matter.
Thanks, Michael. You didn't say trust, but I think that's an important kind of element of these discussions, isn't it? That you want to be publishing research that is trustworthy, in the sense that the potential influences or conflicts are exposed and people are able to know where the results are coming from in a way.
So I think, trust is one of the most underappreciated issues in public health. And I think all of the COVID crisis and pandemic has illustrated that. And it also applies to journals.
Yeah, so I think that notion of trust in publication, I think is a really important one. We should come back to. Tilly, do you have anything you want to add? So everyone can have a conflict. A way of addressing them is to declare them, but actually identifying a conflict can be tricky itself. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting the points that were made about seeing the conflicts yourself, and I think it's really would be interesting. It's not just discussing these with the journal and being open with them, but I think if you're struggling or not sure, I think speaking to your colleagues is really helpful, and people outside of your own department, say, if you want a kind of fresh perspective on things. But you really need to really explore them carefully where you're unsure, and it's always like honesty is the best policy is sort of the phrase that's probably the most applicable here, and journals will be open to discussing possible conflicts of interest with you.
Thanks, Tilly. And Stephen, last but not least, reflections on the answers heard before. Anything you want to bring new to this?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this has been a rich discussion. I certainly agree with Michael that we're all bundles of interests, and on any particular issue that we might be looking at, like with publishing, like we all bring a perspective or interests. But the key issue is like, at what point does that really become a conflict, to the point where we should really be stepping back? I think another dimension of trust is that even if we've got pretty strict rules and procedures on disclosure, like at the end of the day, any particular actor can choose to disclose or not. So there's we do trust players to to be responsible in playing their part. I do think one of the things that can be very helpful is for us to be clearer and more explicit about our expectations. So what are our expectations of ourselves as editors? What are our expectations of reviewers and authors? And I think, certainly speaking for our own journal, in our own policies and instructions to authors, there's more that we need to be doing about making it explicit, like what our criteria, what our procedures, what our processes, what our policies are. Because I think if we make our expectations clear up front, I mean, then the onus on each of us is to kind of respond appropriately to those expressed expectations.
That's a really interesting set of points, Stephen. It strikes me that you use the language, how do you, when should you step back? I think you said, and so, and what does step back mean? So, what are the processes through the publication process for enabling people to step back if they feel that they are facing a conflict? For authors, in a sense, it's they don't have the step back option, I suppose. It's the kind of the transparency option. But in terms of reviewers and of editors, there need to be some step back options, don't there? Virg, you had one last point to make on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. It was the issue about who declares and when you declare. Just when I was listening to Stephen, it reminded me about often conflicts of interest are declared on submission. And that this might be in a cover letter, or some of the journals will have particular boxes that you tick and you present. And it's just to think about who's playing that role, because sometimes the corresponding author, there might be 10 people on a paper, you might not all know each other that well. You've got to think about who's in the best position. Have you talked to the team? Because it does require a conversation amongst all the authors and to understand where they're all coming from. So just a reflection.
Yeah, thanks. So even more complex when you have multi-authored papers. And I know that some journals do require every author to fill in a conflict form. I'm not sure if some don't. But then our relationships with our co-authors are often, they can be quite distant or very close, and sort of that sort of shared understanding of what's a conflict is an important one. Tilia, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that also there's, through the submission process, depending on the journey you make through it, your competing interests could change. So it's also making sure that you can declare how your interests may have evolved through the submission process as well, and there's plenty of opportunities for you to update those competing interests that you submitted at submission.
Great. Okay, thank you. That's a great start. I think we've got a lot of ideas on the table here, and I'm looking forward to pursuing them. Can I just remind those of you in the audience, if you do have a question, feel free to post it in the live Q&A, and if you can either put it to a particular editor, or you could put it to the panel as a whole. So let me move on then. So I'm going to ask this. This is a question that I'm going to start with Zoe on, which is, and this is from the perspective of an author. If you declare a conflict of interest, does it reduce your chances of publishing?
There's the question. So yeah, we're asking people to be transparent, and we're sort of, this whole issue of trust is really front and center. But if you're honest and you go ahead and you declare your interest, does that mean then that you're someone, you may be disadvantaged in some way compared to somebody who's hiding something? And I think, so this is a bit of a tricky question to answer as an editor, I think. And I think my answer would probably be, yes, it does reduce your chances, but with caveats. So, so you could imagine, for example, I receive an opinion piece about a certain program or a certain policy, and the author has written it in quite a positive light. The author then declares that, you know, they have had a central role in the development of the project or the policy. And so I'm thinking, this is an opinion piece. It's written very positively by somebody who's involved in it. I'm not sure this is the most objective piece. And so I might choose not to publish that, or I might seek a reviewer's advice, and a reviewer may think, this doesn't seem the most objective piece of opinion. So in that sense, I think there's a potential for it to be influencing the decision. But on the other hand, if you can imagine a piece of original research, it's been planned ahead, there's been a protocol that's already been published ahead of the actual analysis, maybe it's been registered in a public trial registry, so you can kind of see what was planned before the results actually came in. So if you have an author who has some kind of interest in a similar way, maybe they're involved somehow with the device company that you're that has been involved in the trial, I think that there the conflict is less likely to have influence on the acceptance or rejection of a paper in itself, because there's less scope for bias in a piece of original research. So I think what I'm saying is that it rather depends on the type of piece that's being submitted, whether it's opinion, review, or original research. And I think, you know, we're going to be exploring this a little bit later in some of the discussion. So that's in a nutshell probably what I'd say for now.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it also puts it shows the role of editorial judgment as to whether the safeguards that are in place, even with empirical research, and the safeguards in place, whether you're sufficiently assured that the safeguards in place are doing the trick. So I think that's a very important and interesting area of judgment and editorial power. Tilly, did you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I can agree with Zoe that obviously if you're presenting your manuscript in an objective and unbiased manner, you shouldn't necessarily experience a problem with publication, but you do have to bear in mind that your manuscript, if you're declaring a competing interest, it will be scrutinized with that in mind. And I think what also can be bear in mind with this is that it's not necessarily going to be a straight rejection in these cases. You know, quite often you're given the opportunity to revise your manuscript. The other thing I just wanted to mention was there are plenty of guidelines, especially for authors, on reporting their research, and particularly if you come from a pharmaceutical company, for example, there are good publication practice guidelines that you can look at, which will help you to report your manuscript in a responsible and ethical manner. So there are things out there to help you and make sure that you are reporting in the right way.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else want to jump in on that issue then of recognizing that that it's not enough to report your conflicts, that there is still room for a judgment that your writing is still is not sufficiently safe from bias to merit publication? I saw some eyebrows raised, but maybe we'll, does anybody want to contribute more on that?
With a quick comment?
Yeah, please do.
I found the point about the difference between empirical research and opinion interesting, because an alternative take may be that people know that opinion is opinion, and so, you know, say whatever you want, it's your opinion. And so for those, your guards about, as an editor, certainly my guards about conflict of interest are much lower than they are for empirical research papers. And one of the reasons is that it's not, in many instances, empirical research is not sort of pre-registered, sort of with all these governance processes that are all intact in place. In many instances, it's just seen some interesting data, you analyze them. And so it's just to strike that point that sometimes you're more worried about research, empirical research, much more than opinion, because people understand opinion.
So the readers are in a position to assess, are better able to assess opinion than they are a lack of an objective or unbiased presentation of empirical research. Michael?
So I actually don't think that opinion pieces have a right to what is sometimes called alternative facts. And I think that it's still important to have a review process for opinion pieces as well. For the empirical research, the whole point of peer review is to identify both intended and unintended sources of bias and problems in interpretation. And at least in my journal, opinion pieces, or we don't call them opinion pieces because we're not interested just in opinions. We're interested in people's experiences of leaders. Those also go through a review process and a peer review process to assure quality. So, from my perspective, I think it's important to tell readers what kind of review has been done for each paper. And we have not done enough in that, and I plan to change that for the future.
We're going to come back to this issue of different formats of articles in a few minutes, but I think that those are really interesting things that are coming through. I'm going to pause for a second because our Q&A is active, and so I wanted to feed a question into that's come from Pragati Hebar. As editors, are you required, I'm slightly rephrasing this, Pragati, so tell me if I've not got it right, but as editors, do you have to provide declarations like the ones we seek from authors, a declaration of no conflict? And as reviewers, do we ask reviewers to declare no conflict? And does that, I suppose what's interesting there is reviewers may or may not be blind to authors as well, which raises another element of complexity. Who would like to take that on? Please, Stephen.
Yeah, I expect all of us, at least informally, do have policies and procedures. I mean, certainly we do at our journal. I guess the problem is that we don't state up front, on our website, what those policies and procedures are. So I think, that's something I think that we need to be doing, is to kind of spell out for our readers and potential authors kind of how we manage our own potential conflicts of interest. So yes, we do have informal policies and procedures, but we haven't been very transparent about what they consist of.
Yeah, Michael?
I think all editors have contractual obligations with the publishers. And so in that sense, there are contractual procedures for holding editors accountable for certain, both quality and other issues. I think it gets a little bit tricky when you start to talk about partly the role of the editor of having a certain vision for a publication, which really does mean personal views about what is published and what isn't published.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of is another kind of, another process, back to sort of Stephen's kind of classification of processes and procedures. That's another kind of element of this contract that exists throughout the process, whether it's implicit or explicit, to begin to create the trust that's needed in the process. Virginia, you said you wanted to add something here as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Pragati. Thank you. I think it's become even more important at the moment because I don't know about the other journals, but we certainly are finding that it can be an increasing struggle to get reviewers for papers. And as that pool, tightens, or you have this growing challenge, it does beg the question about conflicts of interest amongst reviewers. And while we do ask our reviewers, do they have any conflict of interest to declare, I think it is something that we need to reflect a bit more on, because the chances of this becoming more of an issue, I think, is definitely on the cards with some of the challenges of getting reviewers.
Indeed, and that may be something we need to, so I think that getting those processes tightened up for reviewers is going to be essential going forward, isn't it? I'm just watching. I'm going to say to Virg and Shay, where I'm seeing the questions is really far away from my screen here. So I'm gonna, if you can be feeding things in, would be very helpful, because the moment I'm finding it, I have to move too far away to be able to listen. All right, let us move on to another question on our list then, which is about the issue of evaluation and implementation. So some funders, or indeed some implementing teams, are responsible for both the program and for its evaluation. Do you worry about this as journal editors? What safeguards do you ask for to be sure that evaluation results in particular are free from bias when either the funder is funding the evaluation or the same team? What safeguards would assure you? Who wants to jump? I was going to ask this. I was going to ask to Stephen first, and then come back to others.
Yeah, I should start by disclosing a bias here. I'm a strong believer in an embedded kind of research evaluation analytic function within projects and implementing agencies. I appreciate at the same time that there can certainly be a tension, and any program activity that one is involved with, inevitably that's your baby and you can't look at it objectively. But I think it is possible, like within a single agency, to be reasonably rigorous and objective. An organization I think that's pretty exemplary in this regard is BRAC, and they have a kind of a standalone research and evaluation unit, which is tasked with doing evaluations of their various activities, and they're not afraid of publishing kind of unwelcome results. So showing where something that they've been trying hasn't worked out well, and I think that's exemplary practice. Like that's what implementers should be doing. And certainly at our journal, we do welcome manuscripts that report on evaluations done by implementing agencies. At the same time, we recognize that there's potentially important problems of objectivity. So we certainly need to make sure that these pieces are rigorously evaluated. So there's an issue of objectivity. At the same time, we certainly don't rule out submissions of pieces of evaluation coming from implementers.
Okay, let me press you on that, Stephen. So you don't rule it out, but what do you tell your readers about the decision process that has led you to allow this work to be published?
I mean, our journal places a lot of emphasis on public health practice, and like for us, it's a high priority to be kind of soliciting material that comes out of program work. And so there's a reasonably large proportion of papers that we publish that do come kind of directly out of program work. So I think, like for people who are familiar with the journal, they kind of understand that that's where we come from. At the same time, like any paper, it's made quite clear like what the organizational affiliation is of the authors, like in the published articles, and certainly, and also from our review process. I mean, I'm sure this is the case with all of my colleagues, is that you receive manuscripts with suggested reviewers, many of whom are too closely associated with the author group. So part of the responsibility for us as editors is to make a determination whether or not those are appropriate reviewers. And so to try to ensure objectivity in the review process, we need to make sure that the reviewers themselves, have appropriate arm's length relationships with the authors.
a lot of those are unobservable. That can be very tricky.
That's true. Yeah,
You're-
yeah.
you can tell if they're in the same department or the same institution, but you don't have a whole kind of employment history of people.
That's right.
Who do those reviews. That is a tricky thing. Shay, did you want to come on this as well? What do you do at BMJ Global Health when you have this these issues around links between implementation and evaluation?
So we don't have a general rule. It's often a case by case kind of treatment because these kinds of issues come with their own peculiarities. But the general sort of principle is to be as copious as possible with declarations. And I think it's also important for each type of co-author to declare their conflict of interest. So if there's a funder who is co-author, they should tell the reader to what extent they were involved in the design and final analysis, for example, which I think is very important to do. But to go back to a point that Stephen made earlier about how a lot of evaluation research is really for local consumption. When you think about it deeply, and it's one of the lessons that I've seen play out interestingly with COVID-19, a lot of the manuscripts submitted to the journal have had their impact on policy before they were even submitted to the journal. So there's a part of me that recognizes that as well, that for this kind of embedded research, it's often to influence implementation on the go, and it's done its work often before it even makes its way to the journal. And there's another point that I wanted to make about more political influence, because I've had a series of interesting instances recently from an African country that I would not name, where authors have spoken, have requested for their names to be dropped out of papers, manuscripts, because there's threat to their lives or to their job because of the message in the manuscript. Now, in those kinds of situations, it takes conflict to a different level. We start to think about what it means then to write a paper from the government of that country, and how seriously should one take subsequent manuscripts from the government in such a country. And in those instances, what I've suggested people do is to remove their names, because I don't want to be the cause for people's death or loss of job. But I think it's an important thing that we would have to grapple with as well in this space of thinking about publishing work that are deeply embedded within government, and governments that want their country to be portrayed in a particular light could go to various extents to make sure that researchers fall in line. And yeah, just throwing that out there, that is an issue. And these two instances occurred within the space of 6 weeks. So it's a thing. And I think journals, and I don't know how better to handle it, frankly, but I think journals need to think about how to handle things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a tremendous responsibility as an editor, both to the individual, as you pointed out, but also to the whole kind of the process of science. That is, so how do you, as editors, take some responsibility for exposing some of those really very serious conflicts? Does anybody else want to jump in on this issue of evaluation and implementation? Okay, then let's take a couple of questions from the Q&A then. So one was when editors, so some of you in this group are professional editors, some of you work in university departments and are active researchers yourselves. What do you do when you have colleagues who are submitting their papers to your journal? What are your practices and rules on this? Anyone want to say? Tilly?
Yeah, I've had this happen where I've had previous colleagues I've worked with before I was an editor. And in this case, I rescind my responsibilities of the editor over that paper. And one of my other professional colleagues on the BMC series will take over the handling of that paper to make sure it's handled objectively.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so create a firewall. Anybody else? Verge or Shay, what do you do?
Go ahead, sir.
So you go ahead first. Yeah. Say it, you go.
Yeah. So it's often what I do is to erect a wall between myself as the editor and that manuscript. So usually we assigned to an associate editor who will handle the whole process, and I would not be involved at all in the decision making for such a manuscript. And it's so in my own personal case, I've sort of made a decision never to be the lead author or the last author of any paper published in the journal that I edit. And I try to nudge my friends away from submitting to the journal, not always successfully. But when such things happen, what I do is to assign it to another editor who handles the entire process.
Virg, anything different at HPP?
Not really, Cara. Very similar to what the others have described. I think, if anything, a very close eye is cast on papers that are I mean, we, as you mentioned before, we're all working within a university, and we have colleagues that do submit, and you know, sometimes ourselves we're involved in papers, but those kind of firewalls that the others described are really important and very necessary.
I think what's interesting there is is the issue of appearance as well. So you may be assured yourselves that you have the structures that are preventing any actual conflict of interest. But what do you do? What can you do to avoid its appearance? And do you actually? Is there any kind of documentation of that editorial process that enables you to say, you know, to be very public about the process behind it? And is there a need for that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Cara. We at HPP, on our Scholar One system, we do document step by step, and I'm sure others do that too, all the communications, and they're all recorded there for exactly that reason. You know, it is something that you need to have a pretty clear paper trail about. It can, you know, questions do get asked, and rightly so. So I think having it something that you can at least demonstrate to people how the paper's been handled, who's handled it, is really important. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Tilly?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this is, you know, where journals are signatories of like the Committee on Publication Ethics. This is something that they mandate, and that there is clear paper trails and a way to audit these kinds of things. So there are processes in place for many journals for this.
All right. So there's a couple of questions that have come in that are back to this issue about the relationship between evaluators and implementers. So one idea is that to allow the stakeholders to be part of the evaluation team, and the names of the stakeholders will be in the article as authors, and they'll disclose their conflicts. What is your opinion on this situation? Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, in principle, I think that can certainly work. One issue that we sometimes face is we'll receive papers submitted from a country, like a lower middle income country, but all the authors are from an institution in the north. And but it's clear from what they're reporting that, I mean, there had to have been some substantial work on the ground. There had to have been important local partners. And we've changed our policies. So under those circumstances, we go back to the authors and we ask them, well, who else, kind of who within the local system was substantially involved? And then you know, we challenge them to kind of engage those key actors. And I mean, usually this would mean we would suggest that they have the manuscript reviewed by these in-country stakeholders and get the perspective of those stakeholders. And as those perspectives are incorporated into the paper, then that justifies having them come on as authors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this raises a much broader issue, doesn't it, about publication ethics and the ethics of doing research in other places without engaging in a serious and committed manner with researchers and others from those places. Maybe if we have time, we can come back on that. But that's clearly, I've come across some fairly shocking examples of that just very, very recently. All right, I'm just going to read out a comment as well and see if anybody wants to comment on this comment. So this is from somebody who says, and sorry, I'm not moving back and forth between my screens well enough to say who made it. If somebody can tell me who said this. I like the terminology of informal contract in trust systems, and I'd like to share one example. If a reviewer is asked to review a slightly lazy article authored by big names in the field, and critically and with arguments states this repeatedly, but observes that the editor likes the authors and their pitch, it might not be a really overt conflict of interest, but an example of a soft contract on contents and an example of how particular viewpoints get reproduced over time. And these types of reproduction structures, which are hard to talk about, but should be. There was an earlier comment as well about what happens when when the reviewers recommend against publication, and yet the paper appears anyway. So kind of the same sort of thing where it's clearly where it gives the appearance again of an editorial conflict of interest. Does anybody want to comment or reflect on that? Those of you we haven't heard so much from. Yeah, Jocelyn.
Yeah. I mean, those two questions, particularly the first, which I think came from Shay himself, unsurprisingly. No, you just copied it over. I think they're incredibly important and probably one of the more difficult aspects of these conversations, because they get at the heart of the accountability of editors and the correct accountability mechanisms for editors. So so Richard Smith, my good friend and former boss who used to edit the BMJ, once said that journal editors are as unaccountable as kings, which I think has changed to a certain degree over years, but nevertheless does really raise questions, I think, about how we can ensure that there is legitimate sort of scrutiny, if you will, or dialogue around decisions that editors make. To the specific examples of when reviewers make a recommendation and a journal editor or an editorial team takes a different decision, I think that one's easy to reconcile for me as an editor, because reviews are meant to be advisory. And in fact, a lot of journals no longer ask for a recommendation. They ask for in-depth expert comments on the validity and the strength and the methodology of the paper, rather than advise, or rather than indicate what they believe the journal should do. And of course, keeping in mind there's often a set of reviews, and as everyone knows, those reviews rarely completely agree. But I think to the question of seeing work published in a journal for which you feel for which you as a reader feels is not a good use of space, or is contrary to where you think the debate should be, I think we have a limited number of mechanisms at our disposal. One of them is letters to the editor, and some journals allow for this kind of interaction or responses right on their website, which can be really interesting and kind of create that debate that's often, of course, necessary in the field. And then secondly, and I see this a lot increasing, is the use of social media. For me, and I'll be honest, it's not entirely comfortable, and nor is it fully mutually accountable, because lots of folks put critiques of what we publish at my journal on social media without, maybe putting their name or even explaining their reasons. So there's no sort of vetting process. But nevertheless, we do have a kind of limited suite of ways for our readers to, readers, of course, who include our authors, to feedback, to critique, to complain about what they might see as, maybe not sound decision-making, or indeed they might see as being a bias. Of course, every editor brings their biases, good, bad, and necessary to their journal. You know, every journal has its character, and content flows from editorial strategies and priorities. Not everyone may agree with that, but editors are in that position in order to grow the character and voice of their journal.
So Jocelyn, that's a really interesting thought, saying that we haven't got enough ways to, so because there's two ways of challenging editors, right? Two forms of challenge. One is I don't like your judgment, and the other is your judgment is itself conflicted. And those are, I suppose, those are slightly different problems to deal with, but not having enough mechanisms for holding editors to account is something we should think about going forward. Somebody else had their hand up. Was it you, Zoe? Or yeah, Zoe, go ahead.
It was just to add to one of the mechanisms, I think, which Jocelyn is aware of, but she's allowing me to mention for her, I imagine, is that if this idea that there's this kind of old boys network and the same old opinion keeps being put forward by the same old people, you know, if that's really something really egregious that you as a reader or a reviewer have found, or as an author, you're trying to publish a contrary point of view, you're a less well-known person, and you think this is really wrong, then there is that most journals will also have an ombudsman. So you can actually complain, and this person is not employed by the journal. They are entirely independent, as in that they're not paid by the journal, so they're not they don't have that that sort of direct connection. And so you can actually submit a complaint if you think that there is some kind of harmful bias going on within editors' decision-making processes. So there are a few other mechanisms. And if journal hasn't got an ombudsman, then yeah, as Tilly was mentioning, with the Committee on Publication Ethics, this is something they also recommend you should have.
And to be clear, so that ombudsman is it's kind of, it could concern, you could write to the ombudsman about publication of others' work, or if you feel that your own work has been treated unfairly because of conflict of interest as well. So you could write as an author or as a reader, is that right?
I think if you've tried to submit something and it's been rejected and you believe that's because, you know, have a cozy relationship with the editor like the other person does, then you know, that could be a reason for complaint maybe.
Okay, super. All right, let me take one more question from, so just to note, Godleaf, sorry, I now know that the question about that reproduction of networks came from Godleaf van Heteren. There's another question here from Pragati, which I wanted to raise, which was, what do journalists disclose about their, journals disclose about their sources of funding? So, you know, if you look on the journal websites, you can see impact factors and scope and indexing, but they don't always show how they're funded or you know, who their financial backers might be. Is that an issue for journals?
I think it is. I think it definitely is. It's Virginia. I think that it's a very good point to highlight, and I think certainly for us we could be being a little bit more potentially more transparent on our website. So I think I can't see who. Oh, Pragati. Okay, Pragati again. Great question. Yes. I think we'll be considering this a lot more after this session. Thank you.
Well, sometimes it's clear, you know, I guess it's clear who the publisher is, but it isn't always clear kind of what the nature of the organization is. Margaret, do you want to say something on that?
Yes, well, we have theme issues regularly, and we always announce our funders for the theme issues, and the fact that funders are not allowed to participate in the editorial decisions, that there's this separation. I do think we could do a better job of listing on our website the broader funders, because we tend to, you know, because we do this for the theme issues, it's, you know, those are for key particular topics, whereas we do receive some foundation funding and corporation funding across the board. And that I think you'd have a difficult time finding. So we could probably improve our transparency there.
That sounds like a really positive suggestion, and it's true that it's kind of, yeah, it's being transparent and clear about funding. Shaya?
I was going to say something about the open access journals more broadly. And I'm saying this because I think at some point in the future, the field or the sector will get to a point where open access journals will have to declare their financials. And I say this partly because in many instances, they are huge revenue generating entities for their owners. And also in many instances, these journals extract value freely from the public, broadly defined. And at some point, the public will ask that question compellingly. And I hope that time comes soon, where when sorry?
In terms of extraction of value, I'm not sure the open access journals are the only.
No, they're not. Yes. No, but I suppose they ask authors to pay, and by doing that, they put themselves in a different place compared to the journals. And I think that at some point that we have to be some reckoning and some transparency. So if, for example, I'm giving my time to peer review for you, I'm giving my time to do XYZ for you, and at the same time, you're asking others to pay this much, can you justify that? There has to be that process of asking journals to justify, for example, how much money they ask for, because in part, they're extracting value from freely available resources from the public.
Okay, thanks for those great answers and reflections. I'm going to shift us back to the question of non-original research. So Jocelyn, I'm going to ask you first to tell us, do you think there can be conflicts of interest that are associated with publishing non-original research? And then you can tell us what non-original research is.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kara. And the answer is yes. I think competing interests and the management of competing interests is very relevant to the editing and publishing of non-original research. And I think it's a topic that's come up almost from the very beginning of this program. So by non-original research, we mean pieces of content that don't report original empiric data, such as in a research article. So they contain instead forms of opinion. So that might be in the form of a review article looking at different treatments, which implies a sort of judgment for how that evidence is marshaled and put together, or things like commentaries or editorials that offer an opinion. An evidence-based opinion, of course, is what we're going for, but nevertheless, opinion has a subjectivity associated with it that we often assume the generation and reporting of empiric data doesn't. I am really, really interested in this topic because I spent a lot of my career editing commentary. And now at the Lancet, in my role, I lead the comment section. So we call it comment. These are commentaries. We do about 300 of them a year, about half of which are linked to research that we're publishing. So for those, the author or the writer is putting that research in context, and by doing so, implying a judgment about the strengths of that research, what its implications are, and that sort of thing. The other half of our commentary section is unlinked in the sense that they stand alone. And those commentaries are written to raise questions or debates in the field, or to highlight neglected issues or inaction. So same thing, it's about offering an opinion. About 3/4 of these are commissioned. So here's a kind of unique situation that we haven't touched upon explicitly, which is sort of the role of a commissioning editor and what the management of COIs mean there. For us, the central goal is independence of the writer of the commentary. And that's because independence goes to credibility of the opinion being offered. So again, evidence-based, balanced, but nevertheless an opinion that comes from that person's particular point of view. And for it to be facilitated, our editorial management and assessment of a person's independence and expertise, the full disclosure of their competing interests is required. So a really sort of classic, I guess, bread and butter type of example is if we're looking for a writer to write a commentary about a piece of research we're publishing that reports the findings of a trial for a new drug, we're not going to go for a writer that has a financial relationship with the manufacturer of that drug, because we know from the evidence that there's a relationship between financial, having a financial link and the positive bias associated with the interpretation and conclusion. So that's quite easy, because as we've talked about in the session so far, the financial conflicts of interest are easier for us as editors and professionals to grasp. They're better defined, they're better researched, they have found their way into policy and guidance, so they're easier for us as editors to regulate. Readers have come to expect that from us. But the non-financial competing interests are more difficult, but they're just as important when it comes to us identifying and trying to select a commentary writer. So one example that I often struggle with, and I'm interested to hear other views, and it kind of builds on some of the elements of our discussion already, is that sometimes we'll want to have a commentary on a new, let's say, government initiative, or a multilateral agency's initiative. And there's sort of two ways to go about that. One could be having an author associated with that initiative, or even maybe the leaders of that initiative, to lay out their thinking in a commentary, to talk about why they're doing it, how they rationalized it, what they want to see come of it. And in that case, it can be useful. And we require then, and I think our responsibility in our contract with readers is that the involvement of those authors with that initiative are very clearly detailed. That obviously requires full disclosure on the part of the authors, but also our ability to assure readers of the credibility of our process and the quality of the work by having very transparent declarations. In other cases, we might decide, well, that government initiative is very kind of exciting and interesting, but we want a more independent view because we want a more critical view. And really, the ability to be dispassionately critical of something may only come from someone who's truly independent of that work. In which case, again, we would assess and determine that using our judgment through the disclosures of those writers. And we also declare those competing interests in the work. And then it becomes, and here I think is where I like to think about, the role and responsibility of editors, but also the opportunity and responsibility for readers. If we do our very best to ensure honest and fair reporting and transparent declarations of competing interests, then we need to defend and stand by that. And that also means being prepared to take feedback from readers, including the likes of which we just discussed in the last question. And I think that's a very legitimate and important role for us to have.
And that notion of being prepared to defend your choices, because in a way, because actually the case of the person writing about their own initiative, their interest is clear, right? And then there's a question about whether that's interesting to have someone who is so interested in sharing their initiative. But I guess what is a little bit more tricky is the person whose interest is not clear, and then we rely on them to declare their interest. And it's a very fine line. Michael, you started to tell us about how so I know that in health systems reform, you have not just kind of empirical research, but you also have these policy reports, right? People who are giving an account of an initiative that they were involved in. So how do you manage that issue of, so again, it's the interest is clear, right? In someone in sharing their perspective on it, but how do you make sure that it's clear enough and that it is in fact interesting? Over to you. And
so,
read this.
Thank you, Cara. So health systems and reform is obviously a much smaller operation than the Lancet. And we have a rather more focused approach and a different approach to this. So we're particularly interested in the processes of reform and the processes for making health systems work better. And from the beginning, we decided in order to do that, we want to give voice to the experiences of leaders in health systems from different perspectives. Leaders of international agencies like the Global Fund, leaders within ministries of health, fighting the Ebola pandemic, for example, current heads of social security institutes, and those I'd actually don't consider those opinion pieces. I consider those more individuals struggling to make health systems work better, how they approach policy, the kinds of analysis they do, and the kinds of strategies they use to manage the political process. So then how do we assure quality? And for me, everything is about making sure that we publish the best papers possible. And we do that through review processes, sometimes asking reviewers who have obviously and distinctly different perspectives. In a sense, generating competing reviews that the authors need to respond to. And ultimately, the decision is of the editorial board, myself, and advisors within the editorials to decide whether a paper has reached a level of quality so that it's publishable. But I think it's recognizing that there are individuals with interests, and those are the interests that drive change and improvement in health systems. And we need to understand that and to give voice to people from different perspectives. And in some sense, embrace the role of individual motivation and drive. Let people understand what goes on inside the heads of leaders as understanding the processes for making health systems work better.
Jocelyn, to come back on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really fascinating set of comments, Michael. And I think what you're raising for us is a sort of different form of article that probably presents even more issues, because what you're describing suggests to me that it's more of a personal view or a viewpoint, which the way you describe it makes me think that that's somewhat distinct from, you know, expert commentary, if you will, which, you know, somehow has, I don't know, in some ways maybe has eclipse the importance of a personal view in terms of its scholarly value. But
I would just ask you to read some of them.
Yeah, no.
Because I don't think they are sort of off the wall personal views.
No, not at all.
They are very much empirically based
what
in analysis and the efforts by individuals to improve systems through both values, analysis, and political management.
Yeah, well, you've misunderstood, because I don't disagree with you. But what I think what's really important in what you're raising is that it's a different category of article that's increasingly being demanded for by our health system strengthening and by readers. And it may involve, you know, a whole different set of considerations around review. So for example, we don't routinely externally peer review commentary, but we do sometimes. And it would be very hard for me to tell you, you know, exactly the formula for doing that. I think in your situation with personal viewpoints, which are, you know, both valid and incredibly important for our field, how do we know which ones to review, and how do we achieve the best result for ourselves from that review process is the point I wanted to make. I find it really interesting.
So Michael, I just want to say, so you said you review everything, but sometimes is that a lighter or a heavier, are they always externally peer reviewed, or are they sometimes reviewed with a different eye?
I'd have to go back and check to say whether over the last 5 years we've externally reviewed everything. But I would say the vast majority are externally reviewed. And then, you know, I read everything and review everything. And it's sort of like, it's not going to be published until it's gone through my personal standards.
What's interesting there is it is getting to this kind of boundary between interest and I think what you would say in terms of standards is quality. And in some ways that the quality of these personal reflections is judged in many of the same ways that a lot of qualitative research is, right? Is this reflection trustworthy, and has it been exposed to the sort of scrutiny and reflection that I can believe this to have some validity, because I know it comes from a different process. It does feel to me like it's slightly different from the issue of conflict of interest, except perhaps that it might be a question to you about why you're publishing this one. So what are the interests that you're facing as an editor in choosing whether to publish this? Those of you who publish other formats of non-empirical research, I'd just like to know how you think about conflict in this area. Stephen, maybe, and then Shay, I can see your head's moving a lot. You may want to say something there.
Yeah, I'm quite sympathetic with Michael. I mean, we similarly publish pieces that we consider to be very valuable that wouldn't count as empirical research. One way I think about this is you've got evidence and then you've got experience. And if you're a program manager, a policy maker, a decision maker, then somebody else's experiential learning can be very, very important. That having been said, going back to a point that Michael made earlier, we don't accept alternative facts or specious arguments. And so one way or the other, there still needs to be some serious review. In our case, we have internal review. I go over everything, and we have a small core associate editors group. And so every piece that we look at is seen by at least 3 sets of eyes internally, like among that editorial group. And we don't put all of our non-original research out to external peer review, but I mean, again, we exercise kind of judgment on that, but quite a substantial proportion we do seek an external perspective on.
Thanks, Stephen. Shayla, do you want to follow that up very briefly with anything?
Yeah, so there's a category of papers that we publish in BMJ Global that sounds very much like what Michael was talking about, just practice, call them practice papers. And one of the key points we say to authors of those is that this is about lessons learned. You're not going to come here to tell the world how great you are. You're going to come and tell us exactly what you learned, what you would do differently, or what others should do differently than doing the same thing you did. So the remit is very clear. And if a manuscript were to come in and with a strong positive spin, it just doesn't go to review at all. So it's very clear what the purpose of those kinds of papers are.
Okay, I want to turn our attention just for a couple of minutes to the issues of reviewers. So if an author, so sometimes when you submit your paper, you're asked, do you have any suggestions about reviewers? Is there anybody that you don't want to review your paper? So that gives you a chance to kind of rule out people who you believe might themselves face a conflict of interest. But if an author thinks that somebody has reviewed their paper who is particularly unfavorably disposed because of issues of conflicts of interest, what can authors do? And yeah, what is their recourse if they feel that the judgments made on their paper are underpinned by conflict of interest? And I'm going to ask Margaret if you want to take this one first, and then we'll see who else wants to add.
Yes, so we include in our submission questions, we ask authors if they'd like to recommend reviewers, and we also ask them if there are any people that they do not want to review their papers. And people do fill that in, but we ask them to specify, you know, we view their research as conflicting, or you know, they have to succinctly state why it is that they don't want that person or persons to review. And we do take that into consideration along with recommended reviewers. But what we typically do is pursue the reviewers that are recommended by our management committee anyway. So, you know, we view that, you know, there are frequently problems, and people do have those with reviewers for one reason or another. So we're open to considering that. And in terms of the second part of the question, if authors find that their paper has been what they feel is improperly reviewed, we do ask them to submit a letter explaining why. And authors do this, you know, so they can't object to a reject decision because they don't feel it's fair. Instead, they have to list all the points and explain why they think it might be, for example, that reviewers were biased in making the decision or unfamiliar with the topic or the research. And then we do actually investigate those. It doesn't happen all that often, and it's extremely rare to reverse a decision that we've made. But we do accept the possibility that reviewers, if the author is able to show why they are biased, we will then conduct an arbitration review and ask new reviewers to consider the paper. We also have, as I think Zoe pointed out earlier, we have letters to the editor that are regularly published, where authors can, people write in to comment on published articles, and the authors then respond. So, for example, that might generate a discussion about, we believe the authors had a conflict of interest for these reasons, and then the authors are entitled to respond.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there's a channel there, but rarely used. And I suppose there's a fairly, you know, I think on first reading, most harsh reviews, their first reading will be that the review's unjustified and unfair, but maybe after a good night's sleep and coming back to it the next day, it feels that there may be more grounds in it, and that it's harder to sustain that argument of kind of unfairness or conflict of interest. But that opening is there. Virginia, did you want to add anything on this issue about what to do when you feel that your paper has been reviewed in a conflicted way?
Thanks, Cara. I think pretty much everything that Margaret said is consistent for our journal as well, in terms of what to do and how it's dealt with. I guess, you know, for me, one of the issues we've just actually, for HSG, we've just published their First Time Women's author supplement. And this has been a really interesting experience that, you know, when you do have inexperienced or first-time authors, spotting conflicts of interest can be quite challenging. And I think that, in fact, sometimes we spot them before authors do as well. And sometimes when they've spotted them, we've also done the same. So I think, you know, if you have an inkling that this is going on, but you're not particularly experienced, then I would definitely speak to a colleague or a more senior co-author about it, have a discussion. but and then come to us. And as Margaret said, you sort of have to mount your case very clearly. But in terms of preparing a case, talk to your colleagues, talk to any senior authors on your team, and take it forward. Yeah, thanks.
The issue of the multiple sources of support to authors is really important, because many people are writing, there's a lot of people probably in this audience who are quite new to publishing in academic journals and aren't necessarily aware of the range of sources of support. So remembering that the journal editors are there as a learning resource as well, it's quite important. There's also a question here, I'd like you guys to clarify. So Gina Teddy she says, I'd like clarification of Jocelyn's view that reviewers are not asked to recommend. Does that make the editors even more powerful in this unbalanced relationship between authors and editors? So maybe just a couple of people, maybe if there's any different perspectives, what is the role of the reviewers, and how can you protect yourselves from charges of excess power, or in fact, that's what you have, power?
I really appreciate that question, Gina, because I've been thinking about this so much lately. Actually, the journal I work for now currently doesn't allow. I hope I'm interpreting her question correctly. The journal that I work for now doesn't currently allow for authors of submissions to indicate suggested reviewers or folks they would prefer us not to include. But in the rest of my editorial career, I worked for publishing companies that did allow that. And I actually thought that was helpful for a couple of reasons. One, I think this idea that authors only suggest reviewers that are super close to them and will, maybe give them a positive review, I'm not sure that's quite true. I would love to see some research on that, and I haven't seen any evidence that that's necessarily true. So there's that thing. The second point is that I think, honestly, that there are very legitimate reasons why you may wish to say to a journal, I would prefer you not send my paper to X, Y, and Z. For all the personal bundles of interest we've already talked about, there's a lot of rivalry and competition in academic work. And I think it's absolutely valid to, kind of redress those imbalances for authors to be able to say to editors, I would prefer you not go there. And the third reason why I think that is appropriate, and I think that we should allow for it, is that editors, as we've heard today, apply a lot of judgment to their work. Like there's a role for editors in this whole process. That's why we have editors, and we don't just have, artificial intelligence helping you academics meet, the requirements of publishing and advancing in your careers. So I always feel like if that information is there, it's just one bit of extra information for me as I'm the handling editor of a piece of work. And I really feel like it has helped me understand. I work for a general medical journal, so it's just so wide that it helps me understand communities and networks of people to learn about additional reviewer suggestions. So I'm actually, to Gina's question, I totally take your point and I support your view, and I think it's a great practice, and I know lots of people disagree with me, but thank you.
Zoe, did you want to add something there? And then Michael.
It was only that my understanding of the question was slightly different, and but I like Jocelyn's answer, and I think people will be interested to hear that anyway. But I think the question was about reviewers not being asked to make a recommendation. So you said earlier about, reviewers are more, we're expecting reviewers to give a detailed critique and not necessarily just to say reject, accept, major, minor revision. So I think, so does that then, make us more powerful as editors if we're kind of making the recommendation, as it were, without the reviewers? And I don't think that is the case. I don't think we are now saying the reviewers have no kind of scope to make a recommendation. They do have a scope to make a recommendation. And but I think what the point is, if a reviewer says reject and then gives a very kind of bland and not particularly detailed description of why it should be rejected, the editor might not just say, oh, well, we'll just reject this paper then, because actually what the reviewer has done has not really backed up their decision. So I think we probably take a combination of the one-line recommendation, but a lot more the very detailed comments that they make, and sometimes they don't always align. So we do make a little bit of a judgment there, I guess, but I don't think that makes us more powerful.
Thanks,
Thank you, Zoe.
Michael, did you want to add something in there?
Yeah, I think, the broader point is that it's hard to write a good research paper. And, I actually teach an intensive doctoral seminar for our students on, what is a good research paper? What does it look like? What are the relationship between the different parts? And how do you do it? And the review process, when it works well, is intended to be a set of constructive criticism about how to improve the quality of a paper so that it is logically consistent, so that the concepts are well defined, so that the analysis is clear, so that there aren't any unfounded assumptions. And there's a set of principles that you can think about so that it's written clearly in good language. And the review process should be a kind of conversation among authors, reviewers, and editors. And in my experience, when it works well, the authors at the end say, even though it was difficult, wow, this really improved the quality of my paper. I appreciate what you do at your journal for us. And I think it's a contribution both to general knowledge, its contribution to improving the quality of publication, and helping us understand the strengths and limitations of everything that's done.
And again, part of that sort of broader set of implicit contracts, isn't it? And so a great review is done in good faith without interest, right? Or with an interest.
Well, it could be with interest. It could be someone who doesn't believe in the ideas or is critical of the methods. And the authors should be able to respond to that in a reasonable way.
Yeah, and defend their work accordingly. That's true. I suppose I meant interests that go beyond a legitimate intellectual debate to some other interests. But I suppose.
Well, we all run across personalities.
Don't we just? All right, we are down to the last couple of minutes. I'm going to see if we can do in a quick fire sort of way a round of suggestions that each of you have to make. So I've asked you to think of one thing that either is something that you'd like to take forward with your journal, or a commitment that you want to make on behalf of your journal that will help to address some of these wide-ranging issues that we've talked about in terms of managing conflicts of interest throughout the publication process. So I'm going to start at the bottom of my screen this time. So I'm going to start with Stephen.
Yeah, I guess for me, it just comes down to making our policies, procedures, and practices more explicit. I mean, I think we probably all have kind of room for improvement in that way. And I think in that way, all of the actors, it's kind of clear what they can expect from each other.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stephen. Tilly, over to you.
Yeah, so my recommendation here would be for journals that aren't already publishing the competing interests of the reviewers or handling editors, that they should be doing this to help with transparency.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you, and that would be published at the bottom of the article as well?
Yeah, so I mean, for example, journals that operate transparent peer review or open peer review, that this sort of information is included there.
Okay, thanks, Tilly. Michael.
So I'm going to talk with my publisher about including a note at the end of each article about the level and kind of review. So no review, light review, full peer review.
Great, thank you, Michael. Zoe.
That would also include a definition of what light review meant. So I think, I mean, I think we do a pretty good job of conflicts of interest for authors. I think we're pretty comprehensive on that as a journal. We do ask for reviewers to declare conflicts, although we don't publish them at the moment because we operate a single blind peer review process. So that would be a bit difficult, I think. But we do a very bad job, even though we are all professional editors. So we have less of a situation where we'd have conflicts with people submitting papers, or maybe our colleagues submitting papers. Editors still do have conflicts, and our policies around declaring them are quite lax, I think, in comparison to all the others. So I think we need to do something stronger about that.
Thanks, Zoe. Saya.
Yeah, I'm very keenly aware that a lot of the paradigm of academic publishing in global health and HPSR has its origins in the biomedical fields. We still use the structure and the language of clinical trials, of basic research in the work we do, but I think that it's time for us to start to rethink what a model of academic publishing would look like if designed primarily for global and for health systems research. And I think the structure and shape and how we talk about conflict of interest, what should be declared will be different. And I think if there's a recommendation I have, it is for us to come together to do that hard work of rethinking how we approach health systems research as global from academic publishing.
Thanks, Saya. Margaret.
So we have information on conflict of interest for authors on our webpage, and we do not have a comprehensive presentation of what we expect from reviewers in terms of conflict of interest or from editorial staff. So I'd like to make sure that we develop a more transparent and comprehensive analysis of our conflict of interest policies on our webpage. And I'd also like to lead a discussion among the editors about it, because although we have these policies in place so that editors should recuse themselves if the authors are related to them, or if they previously worked with authors and so on, as far as I know, it's not written down anywhere, and we have no process for ensuring that's the case. We just rely on editors to speak up in manuscript meeting. So I think we may need to have a discussion and develop more clearer policies for accountability in that process.
Thanks, Margaret. Jocelyn.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really nodding my head. I'd like to sign up to everyone's, but particularly Margaret's, I think, is quite right. And Shay, very much support that much more kind of disruptive view of how we think about competing interests and how we manage them. But if you were to push me on one practical thing, I still think the non-financial conflicts of interest is a field. It almost defines everything outside the scope of what we can manage and define and regulate. And I would really like to see more research be done into the impact of non-financial competing interests, and for journals and editorial associations to try again to put into policy and guidance what the best practice would be for us to manage non-financial competing interests, the personal, the academic, the religious, the ideologic, etc.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Virginia, last but not least.
I agree with everything. One very, very practical thing I might suggest is that, when I look at the guidance that we provide in terms of conflicts of interest, and in fact in a number of other areas too, it's not the most user-friendly kind of information. And I think that generally we could perhaps think a bit more about the diversity of authors that come to our journals and reviewers, and perhaps package things in a way that's a little bit more digestible sometimes. But that's just a simple kind of practical issue, but all of the discussion points, I'd love to join all of those. And thanks to all of the people raising these questions. They've really got us thinking, I think, in a very progressive way. Thanks.
Thanks, Virginia. So HSR team, can I ask you to put up that last slide? So we did elicit some of these suggestions from our panel earlier in the week. So I thought we should just share them and give you a chance to chew them for those that are reflected here. What an interesting session. I have to say, I think that we started in just the right place, which is the point about addressing conflict of interest is not because we're interested in it per se, it's because we want to make sure that the work that's being published in our HPSR journals is high quality and is trustworthy, right? And that trustworthiness emerges from this broader system that relates editors to reviewers to authors. And I suppose the one thing that I would add in terms of practical things is that we need to be aware not just of the systems and processes that we have in place, but that everyone is aware of them, so that there isn't the appearance of conflict, that that we're really very transparent in terms of allowing authors and readers to know what the systems and processes are there, whether that's firewalling for editorial interest, or whether that's the systems for enabling reviewers to declare conflicts. I think that information has to be it has to be made clear within the journal management structures, and then needs to be shared with the broader audience of people who are reading and consuming and relying upon the validity of the work that's being published. So on that, I would just like to thank all of the people who joined the panel. What a great conversation, really stimulating. Thank you for the work that you put in to thinking about these issues and to sharing. And also very big thank you to the participants in the audience who were fielding such important and deep and probing questions. I think it made for a great conversation. Virg, did you want to close up for us?
Oh, sure, thanks, Carla. Shane, do you want to go first?
Yeah, just to repeat the thanks to everyone who joined us, and to for the great questions and comments that people raised. And we couldn't get through all of them, but they got us all thinking, and we were thinking about them beyond this session. So thank you very much for all of that, and thanks to the panelists as well, and to Cara and to Virginia, to everyone who worked hard to make this session happen and flow so smoothly, especially Virginia, who did a lot of the heavy lifting. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. I won't hold you up any further. A great session, and special thanks to Cara for chairing. Thanks everybody.